Ladies and gentlemen, it is so good to be here with all of you today. I don't think I will ever forget the day I first decided to become a teacher. You see, since I was a 4-year-old little boy, I was 100% convinced that I was actually going to become a doctor. And if you would have met me at any point before that fateful day, you would have said that I would be anything but a teacher. And looking at my family, well, you could see why. My brother became a doctor. My sister became a doctor. I got 3 messages growing up, and they were pretty simple. Go into medicine, do something good for the world, and while you're at it, try to make a whole lot of money in the process. And when you go back into my childhood, well, by the time I was 4 years old, I had visited a morgue with my sister to learn more about the human organs. By the time I was 5, I could talk to you quite casually and a little awkwardly about the human reproductive system. I could tell you all about the 206 bones of the human body. And by the time I was a teenager, well, I was spending my weekends shadowing surgeries and immersed in medical research. And no, folks, I was not a very popular kid growing up. And so you can imagine the dismay on my mother's face when this cold winter evening in December, I go to her and I tell her that instead of attending one of the country's finest medical schools, I instead want to teach physics and chemistry to 7th graders in America's most struggling and most violent middle schools. Have you lost your mind? She asked me. Do you realize how much money we've spent even to put you through school? Keep in mind, at this point, I was a little bit frightened and I wasn't about to speak back. And so her questions continued. How do you actually plan to get by? How are you going to pay off all of those student loans? Do you plan to live the rest of your life just scraping to get by? And what do you think society is going to say? At this point, you see, she paused. And she paused to come back to a question that she wanted to make sure I really heard. Have you lost your mind? No, Mom, I promise you I haven't lost my mind. You see, it's just that I've seen too much violence, too much poverty, and I realize how lucky I am now. Oh, so you think this is luck? She shot back. No, it's not what I'm trying to say. You see, it's just that, I want to change the world around me. I want to change the way that things work, I said in my 20-year-old voice, the most idealistic version of myself. You see, I want to give people the same opportunity that you had and the same opportunity that I have. Oh, so you have lost your mind. Let me tell you something, son. That is not your responsibility. She was angry, folks, and I nevertheless decided to spend 2 years of my life teaching. You see, those 2 years in my classroom marked the beginning of this journey for me. They were difficult. They were challenging. They made me question my very identity. They made me question everything I thought I had learned about myself. They made me question everything I knew about life until that day. But they also changed my life in ways that I cannot describe. You see, they showed me that education holds power, real power, to change lives for those around us. And shortly after those 2 years, while I jumped on a plane, I flew to India to meet kids who would start changing my life forever. Kids who would teach me about both the truth and the hope of this beautiful country. And yet I also jumped on a plane to begin solving a problem that was inextricably deeper, wider, and more complex than anything I had ever discovered before. You see, folks, we have 2 big problems here in India that are plaguing India's young people and soon will be plaguing all of us. You see, we live in a country where 76% of kids are destined to drop out before they even get to the 10th standard. We live in a country where you have less than a 10% likelihood of actually graduating from college. We live in a country where if you are a girl and you are Muslim and you are poor, you have less than a 2% likelihood of actually entering college. You see, we have 320 million kids in this country who are below the age of 18. You would think that that is a reality that holds enormous social and economic potential. And yet, study after study are telling us that our kids are woefully behind where they need to be. You see, those studies are telling us that 53% of grade 5 students can only read a grade 2 text. You see, those studies are telling us that the average 8th standard Indian child is at the same level as a 3rd standard child from South Korea. You see, those studies are telling us that when you have 260 million people living below the poverty line, we cannot afford to ignore numbers that are telling us that our future is at risk. We have a problem, folks, that should make all of us feel outraged. And unfortunately, it's not the only one. You see, because the 1.7 million schools that we have here in India, the institutions that were designed and entrusted to fix that very issue, well, they're going obsolete. And to give you a sense of what I mean when I say obsolete, consider this. Back in 1963, 59 years ago, there was an organizational survey that was released. And that organizational survey asked employers around the world one big question, which would become a perennial question. They said, what are the top 3 skills that graduates should have when they enter the workforce? And guess what they said back in 1963? They said 1, reading of nonfiction text. They said 2, computational arithmetic. So can I solve simple division? Can I solve simple mathematic problems? And they said 3, writing with a focus on penmanship. That was the world back in 1963. It made sense 60 years ago. Now fast forward 59 years to 2022, December of 2022, about 11 months ago. They asked the same question in 2022. And guess what employers said? Well, they said complex problem solving, something that machines can't simply take over. They said creation, can I build things from scratch? And they said cognitive empathy, because if I have cognitive empathy, then I can empathize with my team member. Folks, what I'm about to say, I say from someone who has spent much of the last 15 years getting into classrooms almost every single week. The world has changed. The workforce has changed. India has changed in 59 years. And yet, our schools are still preparing kids for 1963. Our schools have kind of stayed the same. You see, the biggest problem underlying all of this is that what's at stake aren't just a bunch of numbers or statistics. What's at stake are real children who have real potential. You see, a few years ago, I met this child named Mehek, and she was a young girl at the age of 16. And she lives in Govandi, which is one of Asia's largest slums. It's not too far from where we are today. And when you talk to the teachers and the classmates of Mehek, you realize that this is a child that is deeply, deeply loved. They talk about how the fact that she loved Finding Nemo, about how she loves books like Harry Potter, and she's read it over and over and over again. And when you meet her and when you spend time with her, you realize that what they're saying holds truth. She has this smile that lights up a room, that exudes utter joy. And she puts you at ease almost with every word that she says. And so Mehek and I, while we're talking, we're sitting in the room, and about halfway through the conversation, she looks at me and she says, hey, would you want to come and meet my mom? And so I said, yeah, sure, I'd love to meet your mom. And she says, would you want to come home? And I said, sure, I'd love to see where you live. And so Mehek and I start walking through the alleys of Govandi. And to understand what I'm about to tell you, well, you need to understand Govandi. You see, Govandi has one of India's largest slums. It has 600,000 residents that reside in 32 square meters. It is extraordinarily dense. It has a mortality rate that is 30% higher than the rest of Bombay. It has a life expectancy that is significantly lower than the rest of Bombay. In fact, if you live in Govandi, you are expected to live until you are 39 years of age. Compare that to 67 for the rest of Bombay. And what you realize about Govandi is that it also sits next to one of India's largest landfills. This is the place where all of Bombay's trash gets dumped every single morning. And the closer you live to this landfill, well, the cheaper your rent is. And the further away you live from this landfill, well, the more expensive your rent is. And so Mehek and I are walking through the alleys of Govandi, and we get to her house. It is this tin shed construction that houses a family of 5. And it sits about 200 meters away from that landfill. And the outside of that house, well, it's tapered with plastic bags and plastic bottles and garbage. It's all designed to keep the rain from getting in. And we go in, and I start talking to her mom, and her mom cuts cardboard boxes for a living. Her father is a rag picker in that very landfill. And we're talking for a few hours about what it means to raise children on less than 3,000 rupees a month, and life and joy in the community. And she gets comfortable after a while, and she pauses about an hour into the conversation. And she looks down And she looks up at me and she says, you know, my life has been hard. It has been difficult and it has been challenging. And she looks back down for a second, and her voice, it starts to quiver and it starts to shake. And she looks up and she says, you know, if you would have known what we've been through over the last 15 years, you would know that this tin shed right here, that it is a miracle. That we think that this is a miracle to even have this. Because we have been through so much. And she pauses again. And she looks down. And she looks back up. And she looks at me square in the eyes. And she said, all of these teachers, they keep talking to me about, you know, Mehek is going to go to college. Mehek is going to go to college. But I just don't know. She pauses one last time. And she says something that I don't think I'll ever forget. She says, I do know this. Every single morning, my family and I, we get up and we do one thing. We pray for a blessing. Because that's what it's going to take to get us through this day. We pray for a blessing. Folks, here's the thing. Everybody wants Mehek to succeed. Everybody wants to fix education. Everybody wants India's children to succeed. The problem is that people just don't know where to start. The problem is that people don't know how to fix it. And I am not standing here today professing to have all of the solutions. But I do think that there are some questions that we need to be asking to arrive at those solutions. And one of those questions is, well, what will it take for India to really leapfrog progress? How do we not spend the next 50 years just playing catch up with the rest of the world? And the second is, in the process, well, how do we ensure the education our young people are getting is designed to prepare them for the economy of tomorrow, not the economy of 1963? How do we reinvent school? And the third is, along the way, how do we keep in mind that the impact on every individual child, it is sacred? We have to remember that our children are our future. And when we give them an education that is transformational, well, they have the power to change the world. Folks, I'm going to leave you this evening with 3 big stories that I think offer a little bit of hope. You see, this right here is Kairos. It's located in St. Louis, Missouri, in the heart of the United States. And majority of its students actually come from low-income backgrounds. And this school was modeled after a WeWork office space. And so when you walk through this school, you will actually see the 500 kids of this school sitting in mini juice shops, decaffeinated coffee bars. You'll see them working in conference rooms. You'll see them in meeting rooms. You will see them doing everything but sitting in a classroom. In fact, I could not find a classroom while I was there, and yet this is a registered school. And so I sat down with Gavin, the founder of this school, to basically ask him what he was thinking when he designed it. And he said, you know, we kept getting feedback that our kids are struggling. They're dropping out of college. When they get into the workforce, they're just not prepared. And so we started to scratch our heads and we started to ask ourselves why. But when we started to ask ourselves why, we realized that the answer was actually somewhat obvious. In today's economy, in the 21st century, kids are largely expected to be in charge of their own schedule when they go into the workforce. Young people are expected to have the agency and the discipline to be able to control their own schedules, their own time. And he said, but even though that's the truth, what we do in school is the exact opposite of that. We tell children where to go next, when to get there, how much time to spend there, and what they should be doing while they're there. And so we at Kairos decided to topple that, he says. Kids at Kairos spend 70% of their time outside of a traditional classroom. They work in groups, they check in with coaches, they check in with mentors. They spend time working together without a teacher around. And they only spend 30% of their time in a traditional classroom. And the results are blowing it out of the water. Last year, Kairos' results were twice as much as the state average. So now let's go further east. This is Hong Kong. This school right here, kids actually spend 40% of their day shadowing professions. And they do this in 6-week rotations. So kids will spend 6 weeks shadowing stockbrokers. And then after that, they'll spend another 6 weeks shadowing doctors. And then they'll spend another 6 weeks shadowing bankers and then fishermen, and they will go all the way through the process. And they'll do that from 8 until 1 every day. And then from 1 o'clock onwards, well, then they will learn literature and mathematics and all of the other academic disciplines, but they will apply that to what they learned that morning. Folks, these are 6th graders. And now I want to bring us back here to India. And I want to bring us to Pune, about 3.5 hours from where we are right now. This is Apsara Academy. You see, this school was founded in 2016 as a leadership academy for girls of promise. And it was founded off the basis that actually you could take 100% of kids from low-income backgrounds and give them something that is transformational. And so when you walk into this school, you will see that kids are getting an education that is just unparalleled. They're studying through the rigorous Cambridge curriculum. They're taking A-levels courses. But that's not it. They're actually spending every single week meeting with advisors. They're spending every single week taking leadership classes, which are teaching them how to take what they have learned and how to change the communities around them. And they're taking that on through projects to actually affect change in their communities. But here's the most incredible thing about Apsara. For the past 2 years in a row, 100% of the girls of this school have graduated, have gotten into some of the world's, not India's, but the world's best colleges. They're going off to the US, to the UK. They're studying in some of the finest schools in and across India. Kairos, Hong Kong, and here in Pune with Apsara. So what are the implications for all of this on India? Well, I think it means a couple of big things for us. I think one is it means we need to reinvent this thing that we call school. You see, our schools need to be microcosms of the world that we want to see, not of the world that existed 60 years ago. We need to reinvent it so that it prepares kids for the future. I think it means that we need to recognize that our schools, as imprints of a colonial era, were actually never really designed to help kids climb out of poverty. If you enter school today poor, you will likely leave poor. If you enter school today wealthy, you will likely leave wealthy. And we need to redesign them to be vehicles of economic mobility. Third is I think that we need to start to be wary of silver bullets. As we all know, silver bullets, they don't exist. And yet people, policymakers, practitioners, everybody trying to leapfrog, always search for silver bullets. And we need to remember that maybe we will move fastest when we keep one guiding principle that should bind us all together. Success happens the greatest and the fastest when we keep this simple. One child at a time, one school at a time, one country at a time. And finally, folks, and perhaps most importantly, I think we need to remember that our young people have the power and the potential to change the world, not tomorrow, but today. You see, young people today are inheriting a long list of problems that we as adults have largely created or perpetuated. Pick an issue, pick climate, pick gender, pick poverty. The issues go on and on. Our best shot at being able to battle those issues is by empowering and trusting today's young people to solve them and to give them the tools to solve them today. Folks, to everybody here in the audience tonight, to the TED community across India, I think this means that we have to act. I think it means that we cannot look at a failing educational system and convince ourselves that this is not our problem anymore. I think it means instead that we need to get proximate. We need to get proximate to students. We need to get proximate to teachers. We need to be spending time in communities, teaching, volunteering. We need to be spending time with kids. We just need to be spending time. And in doing so, I think it means that we need to be a part of the solution. And as we become a part of the solution, we need to demand that our schools have to change, that they have to evolve. Not because we believe that this is some progressive idea, but because we deeply believe to our core that our country and the future of our kids hangs in the balance. And if we can do that, if we can get proximate, if we can act, if we can become a part of the solution, if we can demand change, well, then I think we have our best shot possible at creating an India that is better, not just for us, but for future generations. Thank you all.